Well, if you spend any time hauling a trailer like I have, there's a good chance that at some point when pulling a trailer you had a curb check, or you've hit that pothole that you've known about for a while and maybe forgot about it, and you've had worst case scenario and you've bent your axle. Well, once you bend your axle, that's just part of it. Then you have to try to order you an axle, you have to try to find you an axle. One of the hard things that I see for people to do is how to measure an axle. So we're going to try to show you today with just some simple tools that most people have laying around their place, how to measure that axle out and how to make it a little bit easier to find one when you're calling a parts supply. If you call a trailer parts supply, they're going to ask you a couple of questions, and many people don't know the answer to it just because they've never done it before. So we're going to cover the names of a couple of things on here, what tools to use, and how to use them. We have an axle here. I have this mocked up. This is a bent axle. The two things that you need to understand and know the most are hub face and spring center. That's the question that I would ask if you were to call me to order an axle. I'm going to first show you the hub face. Once the wheel is removed, this is the hub face, the face of the hub. Very important. Then the spring center, and it's just what it sounds like. It's the center point where the spring mounts to the spring seat on the axle. So you have spring seat, and then you have the hub face. This is the hub face. You'll need to take your tire off. It will make it easier to measure. I do have this one up on jack stands just for demonstration purposes, but you can measure an axle on the trailer. If you're able to take it off, it may make it a little easier on you. So there's a couple of things other than spring center and hub face that we need to cover when ordering an axle. These are spring axles. We won't be covering the torsion axle today. We'll do that in a separate video for that's much more involved. On a spring axle, you have straight beam axles and you have a cambered axle. This is a straight beam that's currently bent. That means this beam here is completely straight. It has no curvature in it, no camber. I have an axle here on the floor. This is a 7K 3-inch tube, but if you'll look down, hopefully the camera can get it, right in the very center it is arched up. So this is a camber. So it has an upwards bow in it, and that is for the purpose of preloading the axle. So when you have it on the trailer, your tires are pushed out a little bit at the top. Then when you load the trailer, it brings them in. So that's a cambered axle. Also on this axle, this is a 4-inch drop. So if you'll notice here, the spindle doesn't come straight out. It's up here. So from the center of this spindle to the center of this tube is 4 inches. You'll see these axles mainly on livestock trailers and cargo trailers. Occasionally you'll see them on some dumps and some utilities. So this is a cambered axle, 4-inch drop. The axle we have up here on the jack stands is a straight beam with no drop, and it's an idler axle. The way I'm going to show you to measure this, it doesn't matter if you have a brake drum like the cambered axle or an idler hub like this. It's going to be the same thing. So let's get started. A couple of tools you'll need. Tape measure, just a simple tape measure. If you have an easy read, it doesn't matter, just some type of tape measure. I like to have your grandma's cloth tape around. I'll show you the importance behind this if you're having to measure the full beam. And then just some type of straight edge. This is a framing square. You can honestly use just a thin piece of metal. You could even use a ruler that you would use around the house, and I'm going to show you how to do that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure the spring center. I'm going to flip this axle over so you can see what I'm doing. So to measure the spring center, there's two ways you can do it. If both springs are on the trailer, you can take your tape measure. You can hook it to the outside of this spring and come across, and where the inside of this spring would be, that would be 80 inches. That's a very common axle. So I'll measure it again. I'll even put it on the spring seats. The outside of that spring seat all the way across the beam to the inside of this spring seat measures out 80 inches. So here's where the cloth tape would come in handy. If this beam was bent much more, or if it's curved back, like if you really hit something, you can use this cloth tape to go with the curve of the axle. So this, I'm going to go to the inside of the spring since I hold it by myself. You're going to stretch it out, following the curve of the axle. Don't lose your place. And that's 80 inches. So we get the same measurement. So if you had a big bend in it, it would still follow that. 80 inches is a very common spring center setup for utility trailers. And now I'm going to show you how to measure the infamous hub face. This is the one that people have the most problem with. I'm going to toss that down. So the hub face is simple. Once you understand what the hub face is, I'm going to flip this back over. So hub face. So we've got our spring center. We're at 80 inches. Very important measurement, so write that down. Now we're going to go from the center of this spring to the face of the hub. On either axle, you can actually come right out here and measure it. So you see that 7.5 inches to the hub face. If you have a brake drum axle, it's a little bit harder. So this is where you take a straight edge. You put it all the way flat against the plane of that hub face. You go to the center of that spring, and that's 7.5 inches. Okay, so now you need to take that 7.5 inches and add that together. 7.5 and 7.5 is 15. And you add 15 inches to the spring center. So you have 80 spring center and a 95 hub face. That's the question they're going to ask you when purchasing an axle. What is your hub face and what is your spring center? It will be the same on this axle here, and I'll demonstrate since it's a little bigger. You put that on the flat plane and you measure from the center. So that one measures 11.5. So you would add that together, that would be 23 total. So after measuring the hub face off of this spring, which was 7.5, I said you add those two numbers together. And that would be the same as doing this. Measuring the full width of the beam all the way across. Now this measures out to be 94.5 inches. I know that this axle is a 95 inch. The reason it's 94.5 inches is because this axle is bent, so it's incorrect. So you want to measure your good side. So if you have one side that's bent, you want to focus on your hub face measurement on the good side, or if you have a tandem axle trailer, measure the good axle. But if you don't have anybody to help you get it all the way across, you just measure one side, 7.5. You add that together, which makes 15, because you've taken a measurement here. It's the same as taking another measurement there. You add it to the spring center measurement, which gives you the overall width of the beam. Many people will measure here. Don't measure the brackets, the flanges for the brake assemblies, because depending upon axle manufacturers, these can be different. It can be a little bit off. Most axles are going to be, they're not going to have a half or a quarter measurement. There are some in the RV industry, some specialty trailers, you may have a 94.5 hub face. You may have a 79.5 spring center. Most of the manufacturers now will not build in increments of a quarter. They have to be in half measurements on that. So if you have an older trailer, maybe that's homemade, and say this is 95, but your spring centers are in a quarter measurement, you're going to need to order that with loose spring seats, and you'll have to weld them on yourself to accommodate your trailer frame. Hopefully that makes sense and simplifies that a little bit. So with just a few tools, tape measure, some type of straight edge, frame and square, grandma's cloth tape, and just knowing what the hub face and the spring center is will be helpful. Now we're going to cover something else that you'll need when ordering an axle, and it's most important on the 5-lug axle. So now that we've covered how to measure the hub face and spring center, now you need to know what size axle you have and your bolt pattern. This is 3,500 pound axle. It is a 5-lug. Unfortunately, on a 5-lug setup, you have 4 different options. 2 are very common and 2 are becoming obsolete. I'm going to show you how to measure that. Well, if you ask, well, how do I know what size axle it is? If you still have your VIN number on your trailer, it should tell you on there what the axle rating is. If not, you're going to have to measure the tube. A 3,500 pound axle will be a 2 3/8 tube. A 6 or 7K axle is going to be a 3-inch tube, and they go up from there into 8, 9, and 10K and beyond. If you don't know for sure, it's always best to pull your inner and outer bearing out, so your trailer parts supply, they can take what that bearing setup is along with that hub, and they can match it up on the weight. On the 5-lug, here's how to measure the bolt pattern. So if you were to call me, I'm going to tell you to measure across the hub. You can measure it like this. I don't recommend it. For some of the close bolt patterns, it's pretty tough. So what you want to do is measure all the way across, and you want to measure from the outside of one stud to the center of the other stud. So if I put that there, that's a 5-inch from outside to center. So this bolt pattern here would be called 5 on 5. If it were outside to center at 4 3/4, it would be called 5 on 4 3/4. And they do make a 5 on 4 1/2. And then they also make a 5 on 5 1/2. Your two most common today are 5 on 5, which is going to cover most of your utility trailers. 5 on 4 1/2 is used in the RV industry and the cargo trailer industry. Pretty much everything is going to go to those two. There's still some old trailers out there that are going to take years to change that over, but just because you find the correct axle on a 5-lug, you have a 1 in 4 chance of it being correct if you don't measure your bolt pattern. So just remember, the outside of one stud to the center of the other, that's a 5 on 5. Your 6-lug axle is going to be the same, and your 8-lug axle is going to be the same, up to 10,000 pounds. Once you go beyond 10,000 pounds, there's some metric setups on there. It gets a little more complicated. You'll have to call your local trailer supply, and they can give you some more direction on that. I just want to make this as simple as possible on how to measure the hub face, and spring center is a good start that will help you in your search. Right now, axles are tough to get. Special order axles are taking anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks right now to get one, so you may have to call around if you're in a bind. I know everybody's traveling, everybody's going on vacation. We probably have 50, 60 axles in stock, and I can't always fulfill the need because there's lots of different setups. If you're pulling a travel trailer, there's a lot of specialty setups in the travel trailer world. You may have to call an RV supply or an RV dealer to find one there, and it can be the same in cargo trailers as well. So I hope that answers your question. Hope it helps you out a little bit. If you're on the road, hopefully you're not broke down. Hopefully everybody's safe and having a good time. If you have any comments or questions on these, please leave those below. We're going to do another video soon that will cover the torsion or the Torflex axle, but it's more complicated. We have to go to figuring degrees and outside of bracket and a lot of that. So we'll do that in a totally separate video. We have some more stuff coming up. It's good to see you again. I hope y'all are having a great summer. It's very hot here. It may be hot where you're at, but just do your maintenance on your trailer. If you're going on that trip with your family, make sure you got all your bases covered. Look at some of our other videos as far as tightening lug nuts, checking and adjusting your brakes, your trailer lights and stuff like that. We'll see you soon.